And welcome everyone to this week's BFG review. Before I get started, I want to thank anyone who's watched my previous videos and remind everyone to please like, share, and comment because it really does help grow the channel. Now, with all that out of the way, on to this week's film, which is
A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, directed by Marielle Heller.
And starring Matthew Rhys, Chris Cooper, Susan Kelechi Watson, Enrico Colantoni, and Tom Hanks as Mr. Rogers. This film chronicles the beginnings of the real-life friendship between Fred Rogers and the journalist assigned to cover him, Tom Junod.
So starting off, what were your first impressions and reactions to the film?
I thought it was delightful. Don't laugh. It was a very delightful film. First thing I do want to say is that this is not about Mr. Rogers. He is a prevalent character in the film, but you don't really learn more about Mr. Rogers that you haven't already heard of or seen in the documentary that came out last year. The journalist is the main character in this film. He's the lead. He's the one we follow. He's the one that has the most growth. And I think the marketing was a little bit, I don't want to say deceptive, but it focused much more on Tom Hanks as Mr. Rogers. And while he's definitely number 2 in the film, I wouldn't say he's the main character.
Do you think that you need to know about Mr. Rogers or have seen him when you were a kid to enjoy the film, or can you go in not knowing who he is?
Not knowing who he is, I think, would be somewhat of an issue, but I don't think you really need to watch him growing up as a kid. I did a little bit, I didn't a lot, and I think if you didn't watch him, I think you can still get the story and you can see this friendship blossoming, and this one guy who's portrayed as this saint-like character, he becomes a little more human, and the journalist becomes a little less cynical because of it, and it's just a feel-good story kind of, and it's nice.
So what did you think about the characters, specifically Mr. Rogers and the journalist? Did Tom Hanks do a good job?
I think Tom Hanks did a great job. I will say the one thing, he doesn't really look like Mr. Rogers. They do their best to make him look like Mr. Rogers, and he portrays Mr. Rogers perfectly. I think if you had seen the Won't You Be My Neighbor documentary, you get to see a lot of Mr. Rogers, and I think he definitely probably watched that and took a lot from that type of footage to kind of get his mannerisms down. And it wasn't just an impression, he full-heartedly felt like you were watching Mr. Rogers. And I will say, characters are all decently developed. The main conflict in this film comes from the journalist and his father, actually. There's a little bit of butting heads between Mr. Rogers and the journalist, but that's not really the conflict. And his father did some things to the family in the past that the journalist hasn't quite gotten over, and that's kind of where his growth comes from, is whether or not he grows and gets beyond his anger. And you can see how Mr. Rogers kind of helps him along that path.
Do you like how the movie was shot, especially compared to the documentary?
I think it's hard to compare it to the documentary. The documentary filmmaking is just so different than narrative filmmaking.
But this one, the reason I ask is because this one kind of had, at least from the trailer, the style of it was going for.
I will say that it's kind of there's a very interesting framing device on this film, and that is that it's kind of portrayed as an episode of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. The first thing that you see is the opening recreated by Tom Hanks, the opening of Mr. Rogers, and it's Tom Hanks. And I think that was brilliant because it sells you he's Mr. Rogers kind of now, here he is. All the transitions were in the show where it was very clear models and stuff when you saw a plane taking off to when they went from New York to Philly or vice versa. So I thought that was really interestingly shot. But like I said earlier, I don't think you can compare it to a documentary because documentaries, you usually have to use a lot of footage that you're given. You don't get to choose what footage you use. And most of the footage you do get is usually, especially with this one, is a lot of talking heads.
Did the soundtrack, the costuming, the sets, did they all set up the time period very well? Or was it a little jarring?
No, this film's kind of very timeless. It takes place in the mid-90s, but like the style is not so 90s. Mr. Rogers wore what Mr. Rogers wore. The cars and stuff, and you see some of the technology is toned down, but I would say it was jarring. Kind of like compared to Captain Marvel, which I think just tried to have a little more fun with it. They wanted to really let you know it was in the 90s, and so they kind of put the songs in, and that wasn't really a part of this film.
Were there any standout moments or performances?
So the standout performance was obviously Tom Hanks. I'd bet anything that he's going to get nominated for this. Not sure if he's going to win, but he will get nominated. But I think he should be nominated.
For an Oscar?
For an Oscar. Sorry, yeah. For Best Supporting Actor. I don't think he was the lead. So he should be best, even though he's on all the... Even though he's on all the posters and everything, he's not the lead of this film. And the journalist, played by Matthew Rhys, however you say it, he was also great in this film. There was a lot of facial acting in this, a lot of little twitches of people holding back emotion, and also people letting it out later in the film. But yeah, and another standout moment I really liked is the last shot of the film. I don't really want to spoil it, but it's kind of set up. Mr. Rogers explains what one can do when one feels angry or sad, and then it kind of comes back in the last shot in the film in a really beautiful way, and it perfectly bookends the film.
So how many times did it make you cry?
Oh, right. So what's crying, though? How many times did I tear up, or how many times tears came out of my eyes? Both. Okay, so eyes welled up. It was 2.5 times. One was kind of shortly after another moment, so it's hard to tell if I should count that. And then there was 2 times where full-on tears came out, but it wasn't a lot. It was like maybe 1 or 2 tears would come out.
So what are your final thoughts on the movie, and what letter grade would you give it?
So in the end, I think Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood is a delightful, heartwarming, feel-good film with amazing performances, a great story, great messaging, and just a film that I think we need right now. So overall, I'd give A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood an A letter grade.
Okay, that's it for us.
So those are my thoughts on the film. Let us know your thoughts on the film, as well as your thoughts on the drawing in the comment section down below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and hit that bell notification icon to be notified anytime I put up a new video. Thanks everyone, and have a great day.
Bye!